Chapter 16. Assessing My Son. Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Great men are almost always bad men. Lord Acton, British historian and Member of Parliament. That, in a nutshell, describes what happened to David Miscavige after he joined the Sea Org in 1976. The dynamics there were vastly different from what he grew up with at home. The Sea Org has a rigid hierarchy, and the higher one moves on the ladder, the more power one accumulates. David entered this environment right after leaving home, where he had me and his mother, as well as his siblings, kids at school, and his teachers, who could exercise some restraint on him if he got out of line. In the Sea Org, the game was much like Chutes and Ladders, where you could climb high quickly, but slide down just as quickly. He had entered a more dynamic situation, and relished it. If you were energetic and gung-ho, you could climb the ladder rapidly. By virtue of his status as a Commodore's messenger, he had already been granted a considerable amount of leverage over most other Sea Org members, even those who had been in Scientology for decades. That first assignment of his, which I mentioned earlier, conferred great disciplinary powers on him when he was sent on a mission, and he used those powers liberally, but not in a good way. A friend told me that David once watched her work on a cleaning detail. He stood there with arms folded for a few minutes and then disappeared. A short time later, her superior came around and began yelling at her for not working fast enough. On 2 other occasions, David returned, observed her work, and complained to her superior. She got 2 more lectures about not working hard enough. Later on, David became the person in charge of running all the missions, a promotion that increased his power. By virtue of that job, he could affect any organization in the entire Scientology network. I've already described how David, at the expense of executives senior to him in the Commodore's messenger organization, made himself indispensable to L. Ron Hubbard while in his position as Special PJT Ops. Part of this involved a corporate restructuring of the entire church that established 3 distinct entities that were, in theory, meant to serve as checks and balances on one another and thus stabilize Scientology for the future. The 3 organizations were the Church of Spiritual Technology, CST, which was the final repository for all of Hubbard's Scientology materials; the Religious Technology Center, RTC, which owns the trademarks and advanced materials of Scientology; and the Church of Scientology International, CSI, which manages the church and all related entities. Boards of trustees with lifetime appointments were established. When the church settled its long-running battle for tax exemption with the IRS in 1993, the documents filed with the IRS included the board appointments, so there is a record of the names. A good friend of mine, Terry Gamboa, was appointed a trustee of CST while she was in the Sea Org, but she never knew it until years after she had left the organization and saw the incorporation papers that are now public record. David, it seems, never told her of her appointment. David ultimately became chairman of the board of RTC, though for several years he was occupied with another job. One reason for the corporate reorganization was to create legal separation between Hubbard and church operations. The solution was creation of an organization ostensibly designed to promote his literary affairs. This new unit was called Author Services, Inc., ASI, and David was its head. He oversaw every aspect of ASI, including Hubbard's income and finances. Hubbard, though in seclusion, was still viewed as the head of all Scientology. All authority rested with him, and thus a system of checks and balances was unnecessary. ASI's finance department invested Hubbard's money from time to time. A couple of employees made bad investments, and each lost $1 million of Hubbard's money. Both were removed. Dave and Pat Broker then decided that they would take over the investments. Pat, as I mentioned before, was an old friend of David's from their days at the base in La Quinta. Pat and his wife Annie were Hubbard's closest aides during the last years of his life. Terry Gamboa, who also worked at ASI, says the two friends became heavily involved in speculation in oil wells using Hubbard's money. A bit more about Terry. Her mother, Yvonne Gillum, was considered royalty in Scientology. She was a dynamic, charismatic woman who headed Scientology's Celebrity Center for years. Terry was one of Hubbard's messengers aboard the Apollo, and as such held important executive positions in later years. When ASI was formed, Terry became its executive director, so she was in a position to know everything that went on, including the details of the investments that David and Pat Broeker were making. Terry claims that through their financial wizardry, the two lost a ton of Hubbard's money in oil wells that turned up dry. Terry says the way David broke the news to the ASI staff was not, "Pat and I lost the money." It was, "We," meaning the whole organization, ASI, lost the money, and now you, again meaning ASI, need to make it back. She says that David became intent on recouping the losses before Hubbard found out. The plan he came up with included selling expensive special editions of Hubbard's books and art prints of book covers. Terry says that the staff of ASI was pushed hard to sell these items, and soon they were making $500,000 or more per week from these items alone. David's brutal side began to appear more and more often. Once he ordered every person at ASI to spit on a staff member who had fallen out of favor with David. According to that former staff member, the episode occurred while he was being interrogated on the e-meter with all ASI staffers watching, while David shouted questions at him. To their credit, everyone but David and one other person refused to spit on the man. David and his accomplice chewed tobacco before their despicable display. The church has long denied that David engages in punishment of this kind. For many years, David and Pat Broeker were close friends, confidants, and confederates. After Hubbard's death, Pat and Annie were essentially the leaders of Scientology. Hubbard was said to have given them Sea Org ranks in a published issue before his death that basically cemented their authority over everyone else in the Sea Org. The authorship of that issue is open to dispute, however, and David had a different idea about who should control Scientology. A power struggle ensued between the erstwhile friends. A year later, David won. Pat held one important pawn in the struggle. Scientology's most advanced technical materials in the form of Hubbard's own auditing folders, as well as notes that contained the instructions for higher levels of spiritual attainment that had yet to be released or even codified. That work was meant to fall to senior technical people after Hubbard's demise. Broeker had these materials securely locked away in a location where Dave could not get at them. This gave Pat leverage. According to Mark Fisher, David's former assistant who oversaw corporate liaisons between David and the different entities he was involved with, the only other person who knew the location of the unreleased technical materials was Annie, Broeker's wife, and Dave went to work on her. Eventually, he pried from Annie where the materials were hidden. Former Scientology executive Marty Rathbun told the Tampa Bay Times that he and David executed a plan to get the materials from Pat and Annie. According to Rathbun, David arranged a meeting with lawyers in Washington, D.C. that both he and Pat had to attend. Meanwhile, Rathbun positioned about 20 men outside the broker's ranch in Barstow, California. During a layover in Chicago, David called Rathbun and gave the signal to grab the materials. Rathbun says he then fed the caretaker at the broker's ranch a line that the FBI was going to raid the place in 2 hours. The story worked. Rathbun's men were let in and they carted the materials away, storing them safely at the INT base near Hemet. The church has consistently denied the accounts of former executives as the lies of disgruntled apostates. His one and only chip now gone. Broeker, too, was soon gone. At that point, sometime in 1987, David gained uncontested power over Scientology. Now no one in all of Scientology had the authority or courage to tell him no. The fact of his struggle with the brokers is the only proof I need that Hubbard never selected David to succeed him. David left Los Angeles and moved back to the INT base. His first order of business was to clean house at the Religious Technology Center, purging the executives and staff there whom he believed had sided with Pat during the power struggle. In actual fact, they had simply been following Pat's directions while David was in Los Angeles running author services. To revisit Lord Acton, absolute power corrupts absolutely. I am not so arrogant as to presume that if I ever found myself in a position of holding absolute power, that it wouldn't affect me in ways I cannot imagine. So I can only speculate about what may have contributed to David's corruption. And for certain, he has become corrupt. When I compare the happy, fun-loving boy I raised to the man he has become, the images of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde spring immediately to mind. In his position of absolute authority in Scientology, David became surrounded more and more by brown-nosers and yes-men and women. He never went anywhere without an entourage, so if a low-level executive thought that what David was proposing was nuts, objecting would have been political suicide. I suppose that after everyone agrees with your every pronouncement long enough, you begin to believe that you can do no wrong, and this certainly happened with Dave. The more elevated he became in the eyes of his associates, however, the more he tended to express exasperation with them. The traits I mentioned earlier became more and more evident. The sharp rebukes became daily occurrences, and the tongue lashings more brutal. As time went on, David began to express his dislike for the base and its people. It got to the point that during the week when staff members dressed in uniforms, David and his closest associates dressed in civilian clothes. On weekends, when staffers dressed in civvies, David dressed in full Sea Org uniform. The less he associated with people on the base, the better, he felt, and this distinction in dress made the point symbolically. None of these changes happened overnight. For years, he ate his meals in the dining room with the rest of the crew. He flew in coach or business class, not the private jets he takes today. His uniforms, while better tailored, essentially matched everyone else's. His office was of the same size and had the same furnishings as those of other RTC executives. The room that he and his wife lived in was nicer than other rooms, but he paid for the special features out of his own pocket. One thing that anybody who has known him will affirm: David has the capacity to work very hard. It was nothing for him to work through the night if that was what the task at hand required, at least in the years before he assumed full control of the church. Basically, he could outwork anybody, and to be honest, he was probably smarter than anybody around him. That is a great combination if it is driven by good intentions. I recall one Saturday morning in the mid-1980s when he came up to Gold from author services in Los Angeles. He had been up all night working on reports that would be sent to Hubbard, and someone who was returning to the base drove David's van while he slept on the carpeted floor in the back. When the van arrived at the base, he was still sound asleep, and I carried him from the van to his room, just as I had done when he was a little kid. Beyond the usual day-to-day concerns and headaches of the base demanding his work and attention, there was another factor pulling at David: the seductive lure of celebrity, most particularly in the person of Tom Cruise. This began around 1990 when Cruise was preparing to shoot Days of Thunder. Dave went to Daytona, Florida, where Tom was doing research for his role. When David returned to the base, he pulled his top executives into a conference room and showed them a video of Tom and him jumping out of an airplane and skydiving in tandem. The time they spent together obviously left David deeply impressed with the PR potential that Cruise could lend to Scientology, and to Dave. The first time Tom came to the base, which also was their first meeting, David was on pins and needles, wanting to be sure that everything would be suitably impressive. At that time, it was very hush-hush that Tom was even involved with Scientology. All the records of his auditing sessions were kept in folders labeled with his given name, Thomas Mapother. Tom had been audited in Los Angeles by auditors who were not in the Sea Org, and he was then married to Mimi Rogers, the daughter of Phil Spickler, a longtime and noted Scientologist. Spickler had run afoul of the organization some years before and had been excommunicated, so to speak. David desperately wanted to get matters under tighter control. That is, under his control. And one of his top lieutenants, Greg Wilhere, had finally arranged to bring Tom to the base for a stay and some auditing. David orchestrated every detail for maximum impact on his guest. A special dinner was prepared by Hubbard's former chef to be served at the base swimming pool recreational area, which had been given a complete makeover some years before for just such occasions. Now the area looked like a clipper ship, complete with 50-foot masts with sails, a teak deck, and even a lifeboat. Nothing had been overlooked. Schedules in Los Angeles did not cooperate, however, and Tom was late arriving. The appointed hour came and went, as did the next 2 hours. David paced around anxiously, demanding, "Are they here yet?" Finally, 4 hours after his scheduled arrival, Tom appeared, but told Greg that he just wanted to settle in and get to bed and that he and Dave could meet the next morning. When Greg delivered the news to David, he hit the roof. However, things smoothed out the next day, and Dave and Tom hit it off. Up on the hillside, behind a house that had been prepared for Hubbard to live in but was never used, stood a crude rifle range. David had developed an interest in guns at one point, perhaps a delayed reaction from when I took him shooting when he was about 8. He and Tom used the range and had a great time. Several days before Tom's next visit, he made David a present of an automated skeet launcher to replace the manually operated one they had used on Tom's first trip. David immediately called for a complete renovation of the shooting range and had work crews up day and night for 3 days, totally redoing it, including adding a bunker for the new skeet launcher. The purpose was solely to impress Tom Cruise. I did not see them interact much, but I have been told that they developed a sort of brotherly competitive spirit, each trying to outdo the other. One time they allegedly raced through Los Angeles in separate cars, running red lights, each trying to beat the other to their destination. David's obsession with winning at all costs manifested in other ways, too. He returned from a vacation to Pennsylvania one year and brought back the game Trivial Pursuit. It was all the rage at the time, but he found it nearly impossible, because while he was always bright, his general knowledge of geography, literature, the arts, and so on was lacking because he never finished school. Other close associates of his were similarly ignorant, so when Dave played Trivial Pursuit, he always insisted that his team include a staff member who was up on popular culture and general knowledge to ensure that he always won. Given all that, Dave's preoccupation with winning ties in with the analysis that follows. In 1953, Hubbard wrote an essay in which he detailed characteristics of a toxic personality type. He listed the following traits as indicative of such a personality, and here I am paraphrasing the original. Each point is followed by a father's analysis. 1. If something unfortunate happens to a person, the toxic personality thinks the misfortune is either ridiculous, a mere trifle, or that the person deserves it. I once contracted scabies from sleeping on an unclean mattress at Gold. Scabies is a contagious itch caused by a tiny mite that gets under the skin. It is horrible. The itching drives you nuts. I saw Dave while I was infected, and he shouted, "Don't get near me! Stay away from me!" He was afraid that I might infect him. He had no concern for me at all. It was all about him. The infection got so bad that I left the base and stayed with a Scientologist in L.A., where I could lie out in the sun to help kill the mites. 2. If someone does something to the toxic personality, the toxic person always regards what happened as extremely important and egregiously bad, and thinks the damage can never be overcome. A common complaint of David's was how overloaded he was with work sent to him by staff from the various units on the base. His office building was called Building 50, based on its designation on a property use plan, and it had a large open conference room on the ground floor. He regularly brought the musicians to that room and showed us the heavy cardboard boxes of submissions lined up around its perimeter. "Look at this," he would bark. "Look at the crap I get from you guys. I have to check everything because nobody on the entire base can be trusted. Look what you're doing to me." That was a standard refrain. How overworked he was, because he was the only one who could be counted on to get things done. If David ever felt that someone had crossed him, that person would go into his black book forever. You could never mitigate the damage to David if you got on his bad side. No amends would ever be acceptable. One example was Mark Yeager, a one-time friend of David's who served for years as the head of the CMO and worked with David in RTC as Inspector General for Administration. Mark was the poor sap who spent that whole year living in the swamp at Gold after he crossed David, although no one ever learned exactly what had happened. Some years later, when I needed to make up for something David regarded as damaging to him, Mark told me in exactly these words, "I don't know how you are ever going to make up the damage to COB. Even those convicted of crimes in courts of law can pay their debt to society and go on with their lives. Not so with David. He will hold a grudge until the end of time." 3. Anything that another person can do is without real value, according to the toxic personality, or can be done better by someone else. Because of my sales experience, I helped the salespeople in Los Angeles improve their skills at David's behest. I trained them by using simple Scientology principles, such as having good communication, getting agreement bit by bit, and so on. Every person I trained wound up being able to sell. Later, when I was no longer doing that training, sales began to flag in some areas. When Dave learned that the organizations were naming me as the person who had helped them, his comment was, "Come on, man, I could fart more sales than you." This speaks to perhaps the worst thing that anybody in an executive position can do. A good organization will always be stronger and more effective than a single individual, no matter how capable that individual is. A manager can wreck an organization by destabilizing the line of authority, by reaching down to lower echelons and bypassing those who are supposed to have authority over the area. I observed David for nearly 27 years in the Sea Org, and this was his stock in trade, jumping the chain of command. He might be riding around the base on his motorcycle when he spotted one of the gardeners. He would go over and talk to her, and verbally give her an order to do something that was completely off that day's to-do list. It might not even be her job, yet he would expect her to do it. Let's count the number of echelons jumped in this simple 1-minute conversation. The gardener's direct supervisor, the head of the grounds department, the head of the estates division, that person's direct senior supervisor, the head of Golden Era Productions, the CMO unit assigned to oversee all of Gold and the executive in the next higher CMO organization, which is called CMO International, and tasked with overseeing Gold from an international perspective. One 30-minute tour of the base per day might find David issuing several of these random uncoordinated orders. The havoc that his chronic bypassing caused would be hard to describe and impossible to catalog, since most of it was not written down but issued only verbally. 4. The toxic personality tends to be either sexually repressed or perverted. A basic Scientology concept is that life in its many forms is a matter of simply trying to survive. Scientology divides this urge to survive into 8 separate dynamics, as Hubbard called them, that mirror the activities of life and the universe. Survival for oneself, survival through sex and the family, survival through groups, survival as part of humankind, survival as part of all living things, plants and animals, survival as part of the physical universe, survival as spirits or universal thought, survival through infinity, the supreme being, God, the Creator. Hubbard often talked about the second dynamic in his writings and lectures, noting how most people had hang-ups about sex, but he more or less dismissed these as trifling compared to the deeper issues that he felt posed much greater blocks to spiritual advancement. Hubbard mostly viewed relationship or marital blow-ups as distractions from the important work Scientology has to do to clear the planet, Scientology's rallying cry to achieve its aims of a civilization free of crime, insanity, and war. In the early days of the Sea Organization, Hubbard was loath to regulate Sea Org members' personal lives. But in the late 1970s, he finally approved an issue written by one of his messengers that put the kibosh on sexual relations among unmarried Sea Org members. David got behind the new regulations, but over time he seemed to be dead set against the second dynamic in all its forms and manifestations. His attitude seemed to be that staff members, and by extension all people on planet Earth, were more concerned about sex and having kids than with helping him expand Scientology. He went to extremes to make his displeasure with the 2D felt. The culture of the Sea Org with respect to sex and the family began to change. The group and its important work had always taken precedence over the family, but as David's influence as Scientology's new leader seeped down through the Sea Org hierarchy, the effects would be seen as shocking to the average person. What follows are a few examples of actions taken while he was at the helm. Anyone in his org, RTC, who was married to someone working in a different unit on the base either had to divorce the spouse or leave RTC to be posted to another unit. Some staff actually divorced their longtime spouses. Husbands and wives often were split up when one was assigned to an outlying organization, sometimes for years at a time. One couple I know were separated for several years, when the husband was sent to take an executive position in England, while the wife remained at Gold. That was not the only instance, not by a long shot. With other restrictions on travel and time off, for example, even people with a spouse working in Los Angeles might as well have been in Timbuktu, given how infrequently they were able to see each other. Women on the base were forbidden to have children, and I know that several former Sea Org members have claimed that they were pressured by colleagues or supervisors to have an abortion. I also know that if a couple wanted to keep a child, they were sent off the base to inferior postings. The church has denied that it has pressured anyone to have an abortion. People who already had children when they came to the base were not allowed to live with their children. Instead, their kids were kept at another facility 10 miles away. Some staff members who had children in Los Angeles were allowed to drive down on Saturdays to spend the day with them. Family time, it was called. Parents at the Los Angeles organizations initially had 1 hour each day to spend with their children. Then, under some pretext, family time was canceled, which created a great deal of stress for many parents and their children. After that, parents and their children had limited opportunities to see each other. My granddaughter, Jenna Miscavige Hill, wrote in her book that she had seen her parents only a few times over the course of several years, and even then only briefly. In the last decade I lived at the base, marriages were exceedingly rare. Except for one, I am not aware of any marriages between staff members, a restriction that I am told has only recently been relaxed. Any memos or issues that needed to be written to enforce these rules were written by others, so as to put a layer of plausible deniability between their originator and enforcement of the decrees, but I am positive that any such orders came from David. The final example I'll mention comes under the heading of perversion. I know that former Scientology executive Tom DeVocht and others have claimed that David has read out loud the sexual activities of individuals as confessed in their auditing sessions. Friends of mine have also observed this. Scientology representatives have denied it, saying that David has always rigorously upheld the sanctity and confidentiality of ministerial communications. 5. The subject of food and eating is restricted by the toxic personality. While David's own food allowance runs into many hundreds of dollars each week, the food allowance for staff members at the base was sometimes reduced to less than $1 per person per meal. That is less than $20 to feed someone for an entire week, while that person is working upward of 100 hours. The galley staff performed miracles with such paltry allowances, and somehow people remained fed. The usual punishment in regard to food was to restrict an offending staff member to plain rice and beans for every meal until that person reformed. This could sometimes go on for weeks or months. One time, Becky was assigned to a diet of rice and beans. We were at a meal, and I lifted a piece of meat from my plate and moved it toward hers. Another person sitting at our table said that if I did that, he would report me. As I said earlier, people become trapped by their own agreement to certain rules. This person was agreeing to the rules of the group. Though left to his own devices, he would not have cared less what Becky ate. Why would he have reported me? One rule was that if you observed someone breaking the rules and did not report that person, you would be considered as guilty as the offender for something as trivial as sharing food. I have never lived in East Germany or North Korea, but I am guessing similar regulations were being enforced there too. David, meanwhile, was dining on New Zealand lamb or Maine lobster, with a personal chef on call for him, his wife, and closest circle. 2 entrees were prepared for each meal, in case one was not to his liking. One of the facilities on the base had a refrigerator that was about 6 feet wide and stocked with foods, especially and only for David and his wife. During my nearly 27 years in the Sea Org with my son David, I observed in him on numerous occasions each of the traits I have described. I wish I was not writing this, but it is the truth, and other people I know would say and have said the same. A book by Harvard psychologist Martha Stout, The Sociopath Next Door, is based on her decades of study of toxic personalities. In it, she claims that 1 in 25 people in the United States suffers from a mental disorder that leaves them without a conscience. Such people, she writes, never feel guilt, shame, or remorse. She contends that just as some babies are born without a hand or a limb, sociopaths are born without a conscience. Further, she writes that few are the deranged killers we see in movies or read about in the news. Rather, one of the chief characteristics of these conscienceless people is a charisma that can make them more interesting, more charming, more spontaneous, more intense, and more appealing than other people. Not all people who have these traits are sociopaths, of course, but because of their ability to seduce others with their charm, they can be tricky to identify. I will leave you to draw your own conclusions about why I mention Stout's book in this chapter. I have no doubt that it has been much harder for me to write this chapter than it is for you to hear it. David, after all, is someone I have known since I peeked beneath that blanket outside the delivery room on April 30th, 1960. He and I had countless wonderful moments together, and I loved him as I love all my children. Yet the truth is the truth. I believe that people change throughout their lives, but that those changes are not always for the better.